Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a concept and art overview of Dante's Inferno. A couple of housekeeping things first I've been asked to kind of just let the audience know about. One is to, if you can, turn off your cell phones. And, yeah, that's about all I've been told to tell you guys, so. Okay, so Dante's Inferno. My name is Ash Wong. I was the art director on this project. We just recently wrapped up and went out on February 9th. So the game's been out for about a month. It's a project that was in production for about 2 years, end to end. And in the next 60 minutes, I'm going to take you through a bit of an art overview on the concept art development, but actually art development as a whole. I'm going to talk a little bit about the poem because it's huge in terms of the conceptual framework that we started from. I'm going to talk a little bit about the team as well and the birth of the project. So let's start with the poem because it's super important in terms of thematically what the game was about. So the Inferno, by the way, how many of you have read anything from the Divine Comedy or kind of remember bits and pieces of it from high school? Yeah, a good number of you. It's a pretty prolific piece of work. And it was part one of three of a very seminal piece of literature called the Divine Comedy, written by a medieval poet named Dante Alighieri in about the early 14th century. The importance of the poem is threefold, really. The first was that it was the first large body of work written in the Italian language, not Latin, the Italian language. So basically, it was appreciated by a lot of the general population. The second thing, of course, was that it was a medieval overview of the afterlife. And Dante was incredibly imaginative, actually, in the way he kind of conceived of the poem, because he actually hybridized elements from both Greek mythology in addition to Christianity. So he laid these over top in terms of his construction of what he was describing on his journeys through the afterlife. And then the third thing that's super important is that it had a huge cultural ripple effect, meaning that in subsequent centuries after the poem was written, a lot of our kind of archetypes about what hell is like really stem from what he kind of wrote about and what he kind of created. So it influenced a lot of artists in subsequent centuries and generations. Rodin's Gates of Hell, which, by the way, if you guys ever have a chance to go down to Palo Alto to the Cantor Museum, there's a copy of it there. And actually the figure, which is one of his most famous sculptures of the thinker, is actually Dante. And of course there's a huge tradition of painting and music that followed that was inspired by the subject matter of the Inferno and the Divine Comedy. Well into the contemporary period where people like Dali did a whole series of watercolors based on the Divine Comedy, certainly movies like Seven, some of Neil Gaiman's early Sandman comics talking about Lucifer and the underworld, and of course Wayne Barlow's Inferno, which was his particular take on the Inferno written by Dante. Incidentally, I'll talk a little bit about Wayne because we had a great chance to kind of work together on this project as well. So the poem specifically for the Inferno is really a first-person journey by Dante Alighieri down through the circles of hell. And he constructs this and divides it up into 9 circles, and it's a first-person almost travel log. And he's guided by a Roman poet named Virgil. And he divides hell into 2 sort of primary sections, the upper circles and the lower circles. The upper circles of hell are basically sins of incontinence or sins of the body. Those were less severe to Dante in his writing of it. Incidentally, the further you cascaded down into hell, the greater the severity of the sin. So in the top 5 circles, we kind of have sins to deal with the body, like I said, so lust, gluttony, greed, all that kind of stuff is there. And that, he felt, was less severe because it was less controllable. You were submitting yourself to an urge and coming out, basically committing a sin as a result. The lower circles were much more severe to Dante, and these were sins where you were kind of thinking about it. You had a malicious idea about how to screw somebody over or commit an act of evil. You knew about it, that it was bad, but there was a lot of forethought involved. And when he wrote about it in such a rich and vivid way that you could literally map hell out in the poem. A lot of the landmarks that he created, all of that kind of stuff was very richly imagined, so much so that basically we spent a little time on the dev team really kind of mapping it out. And so we had this huge whiteboard where we literally pulled hell apart and dissected it. The 3 rivers of hell have their origins in Crete. And as you kind of cascade down, a lot of sort of what he's written about, we kind of implemented in. And we did that so that we could guarantee some degree of authenticity and we could give a genuine nod to the poem. It also gave us a chance to kind of have anchor points in the level design. So that map developed into this version, which is really what we used in our UI. So as far as the team goes, Jonathan Knight, who is the senior executive producer, in late 2007, following The Simpsons, he'd been thinking about this idea for some time, but he had already done a number of story treatments, script treatments, and so by the time a lot of the senior staff joined in early January of 2008, we had a story that we could sort of latch on to, at least the beginnings of it. It was a small team of about 12 or 13 people with very much a startup atmosphere. Even though we worked under the umbrella of EA, it was sort of like just this group in the far corner of the fourth floor at EA. And the idea at the beginning was really to fail as fast as we could, so we grabbed whatever tools we had and we kind of worked up the game as fast as possible. One section of all the core game mechanics and stuff was actually done on the Simpsons engine, while on the graphics side we began looking at what Dead Space and Godfather were doing at the time to sort of see what we could Frankenstein out of what they had been doing to create the graphics engine. These are some shots from very, very early on in terms of the game mechanics, and so it's all done in the Simpsons engine, so it's got this toon shaded kind of look on it. And at that time, Dante really had just a broadsword, was about as far as we were kind of looking at in terms of the weaponry. And none of this was designed to explore the visual look of it. This was purely prototyping for game mechanics. So on the visual dev side, we kind of went along three axes at the beginning while the designers were kind of playing and working up the mechanics. Our core focus was what was the game going to look like? In other words, what was the rendering treatment going to look like? The second part of it was what was hell going to look like? As I said, Dante had imagined it so richly. For all intents and purposes, it can be argued that hell really was one of the most major characters in the game. And then the third component was really what was the hero and the heroine going to look like. And, we did a little work on Lucifer at the beginning, too, so we kind of went after that triumvirate of major characters. So as I said, the story had been developed, and the first thing that we started to kind of look at was an idea for the color script. And to follow this here, you really start at the upper left, and you go down, and then start at the upper left, go down, and then start at the upper right and go down to the bottom, which is really treachery. We started with cool colors. We ended in cool colors, so we could kind of loop the story together in one kind of cohesive circle of color. In terms of the look development and the rendering treatment, we were very much influenced by classical painting at the beginning, and especially paintings that had a heavy use of high contrast lighting and chiaroscuro. And there were several reasons for this. One was the classical nature of what the topic was felt kind of, it had an affinity with this material. The second thing was that with sort of paintings that had a heavy use of chiaroscuro, hell's an awfully dark place. And so if you can't hide it, you make it a feature. And it really seemed appropriate to kind of allow the edges of the frame to recede into darkness, both to kind of imply the mystery that we wanted to imbue hell with, but also that aspect of having kind of terror existing at the edges of what you could possibly see was kind of a nice thing to have. The other third agenda, which was a little bit more of a slightly technical one, was one of the core mandates at the beginning when we started to work on this game was, besides being a combat-centric game, we decided pretty early on to go after 60 frames per second, and part of the reason for that was to ensure that we could have really high rate of feedback on the controller. We're going to spend a lot of time kind of hitting things and smashing things, and we wanted to really make sure that immediacy and feel in the hands of the controller was there. So we went after 60 frames per second, which really scared the crap out of the art team, especially myself. So also using the idea of having darkness around the edges of the frame and allowing it to recede meant that we didn't have to worry about detailing the craziness of the world out into every single corner. We could let that recede into darkness and just let that be about mystery. And so these are some images from the very first bit of look rendering development done on the Dead Space engine. We didn't even have a moving character. That's just a static model. And here you can kind of see where we were starting to move towards, where the edges of the frame move into blackness. We just subtly imply a little bit coming out of what's in the dark background, but the character has a pretty high level of high contrast lighting. And that's Isaac in the middle of some of our first enemy characters, the unbaptized babies. So the world of hell. Setting the visual table for this, it was really built on 4 primary legs. The first was getting a sense of scale, majesty, and awe to hell. It's a vast, vast kingdom. We wanted a sense of weight to the architecture. We wanted a sense of imposition to it. We wanted to make it basically feel like humans really didn't matter down here. So we looked at early Mesopotamian architecture, some stuff from Petra. We looked at some of Hugh Ferris's illustrations, and certainly in the 20th century we looked at fascist architecture, which as one of its core mandates is really, it's a pretty dehumanizing type of architecture. The second anchor point was really getting a sense of decay and age. This was a place that was well beyond really time itself. And so even though surfaces were hard, we looked for ways to kind of convey that sense that things were constantly falling apart, that they were in disarray. The third part, and whenever we kind of talked about sculpture or revealed it, it was kind of like looking back at a way to kind of convey that through something that felt somewhat skeletal, both to get interesting silhouettes out of the architecture, but also something that sort of spoke of death. The third part that we kind of heaved this development on was, and this is what probably is a distinction for our game, is that beyond being just kind of like a really disarrayed, dark, gritty environment that felt kind of post-apocalyptic or whatever, the big thing about hell that for us that differentiates it is the humanity aspect of it. It's filled with people. And there's this sense of kind of displaced humanity and loss, and we wanted to make sure that we imbued that both in the character design but also in the world design. And then the fourth thing was something that was a bit of more of a challenge to kind of get through, but it was something that I really like to stress to the artist, which was how to metaphorically, in a visual kind of way, express the idea of pain and torment. So, you can literally have it in terms of having somebody have an expression of pain, but you can also design the world, be it a cliff, a rock, a piece of architecture, the skin of a character. If you put that kind of texture quality on it, where it looks distressed, where it looks pulled, where it looks twisted, where it looks tortured, where you tear at it, all of those things also speak to that idea of kind of pain. And so that was something that we went after as consistently as we kind of could. So the first level that we kind of began development on, and this became sort of also our visual target level, was Limbo. And Limbo is really kind of like the Ellis Island of hell. It's not truly hell just yet, but the shades are basically dropped down in here, and they're kind of processed, and they take the first journey into hell. And on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, both these images were done by Craig Mullins. Early on, we kind of contracted with a few outside artists. Craig was one of them. Obviously, Wayne Barlow, as I mentioned before. We did some work with Sam Mishlap, who worked on The Prince of Egypt, and Dwayne Turner was a great comic book artist. But Craig, basically, when we first kind of began looking at this, on the left-hand side is really the harbor where people board a giant boat to cross the River Acheron. Traditionally, this boat has always been illustrated as a single, lone, mysterious figure on a tiny little skiff kind of rowboat kind of thing, and we really blew that out to be a much more epic scale, almost the size of a cruise ship, because, we're processing so many people, so we wanted to get a sense of lots and lots of people. And you arrive on the other side, which is really the Hall of Kings, and all those little kind of almost dot-like things, and I don't know if you can see it too well on the slideshow, but basically this hordes of people making their way to that structure in the background, which is where King Minos is, and he passes judgment and sentences people to their rightful circle of hell. So Wayne came on board, and the first character that we worked on was Charon, who is really that lone, mysterious figure that generally pilots the boat. And originally we thought this would be a character that Dante fights. And so he brought a lot of that kind of ship architecture into the design of him. But as we kind of evolved the concept, we began to say, well, what if Charon wasn't a character, but Charon was the boat? And so we began looking at that kind of direction in terms of inflecting something kind of, different about where we could kind of go with the traditional archetype of what Charon usually is represented as. And a lot of sort of using Wayne and Craig and even our internal concept artists, a lot of what we did was really at the beginning, we tried to get out way ahead of design. So a lot of this stuff is done in absentia of design. And the idea was to create basically a set of catalyst images, what I called things that we could just kind of blue sky off of. And when design started coming in and inflecting what their needs would be, we could withdraw some of the key ideas and kind of pull them out of some of this blue sky catalyst stuff that we had been kind of working on. And so Wayne's concepts developed, and then basically we took it over internally, and you can kind of see we started bringing in elements of the archetype of the Ark, of Noah's Ark, and bringing that in and infusing that into the ship design as well. And the skin of the boat, the oars, which look like fingers with nails, and obviously the twisting of that skin was, as I mentioned before, was really important to kind of start to lay down that feeling of pain and age. Once design came on board, we started to, obviously a lot of you probably have seen stuff like this. This is really design white boxing, and they begin to kind of like carry out gameplay stuff. It was very important, even though we were kind of off in our sandbox doing art. It's super important to respect what design is doing, and it was always about kind of gameplay first. And so a lot of times they would produce white boxes, and Mike Chang, who is the lead level designer at the time, we would spend a lot of time going back and forth in terms of ideation, both visually and also gameplay, in terms of how we could make sure that both were working in conjunction really well. And this is the harbor over which basically we would then kind of like sign over top of. How to get people down into limbo became an interesting idea. We had people falling out of the sky, but we also thought it would be pretty epic for Dante to be, as he was passing by these cliffs, have these huge, epic, giant heads that would be erupting from the rock. And essentially, these things would be basically vomiting people out. So conceptually, we didn't always do everything through drawings. Oftentimes, basically, I would have the VFX artist kind of, do some rough concept stuff as well. So I'm going to show a brief little movie here. So we would, do these little treatments in Maya where we would quickly mock up, what that would be like, and so that somebody would have an idea of, how to kind of, for implementation further on down the road. So, as I said, Limbo was the first level, and we used it as a visual target level as well, meaning our rendering engine and the features that we kind of wanted in the engine. So this is a paint-over of the Hall of Kings, and it allowed us to do a dissection of what we needed for lighting and VFX. And I won't get into a deep technical discussion on the lighting, because I could probably spend an hour just talking about that. But essentially, this is really a composite of how our lighting worked based on that original drawing. So this is just the base model textured with no lighting in it. And we used a combination of bake lighting, cube mapping, and SH lighting, for those of you who kind of want to know a little bit background of some of the stuff that we kind of threw into the cake mix, if you will. So this is the bake. This is the SH grid, basically the SH lighting. And then this is the dynamic layer. And when you kind of sandwich that all together, you kind of get what our final look ended up being. And that's compared to basically the paint over. So that's how we did a lot of paint over studies originally when we started developing the graphic stuff, just to make sure that we were kind of on target with what we needed. At the very end of Limbo, you have King Minos' court, which is this building here. We looked at theater design, we looked at stadium design, because there was something very theatrical about this experience, about him passing judgment. So even though it's a bit of the theater of the macabre. And Charon's design, King Minos' design was another character that basically Wayne took a stab at early on. And he played with the idea of the tentacles a lot, simply because King Minos, he passes judgment by basically taking the damned, throwing them on the spike, and wrapping the tail around this spike. And the number of times he wraps his tail around that spike corresponds directly to the number of the circle you get committed to. So a lot of times, the designs would come out, and sometimes they felt a little too alien. We were trying to figure out ways to kind of ensure that there was this kind of sense of humanity in the design. And we began to take it over. We played with snake imagery. We played with, all that kind of stuff. He was a king, so we were trying to figure out ways to kind of get that aspect of nobility into him, even though it was kind of misplaced. And so in this example here, we looked for a way to kind of, one thing that we wanted to ensure, playing with that line, justice is blind, we actually mechanically kind of covered his eyes. We tried doing it that way. And Jeff Adams, who is the lead concept artist working on this one, we kind of looked at this image and it didn't feel quite right, and we were kind of giggling a little bit, and we found kind of like this image on the internet, And so it's kind of like, Slash from Guns N' Roses. And eventually, basically, we arrived at this where we basically carved out the sockets of his eyes and then allowed this kind of old, decrepit flesh to kind of grow over top of it. And then this is the ZBrush model that came out of. And let me just show you a little bit about him in action, basically. The composite you're going to see here is basically not just King Minos, but actually the VFX running over top as well, in terms of how we kind of, layer in the visual look of the frame. So this is without any VFX at all. It's a straight up rendering. And then we start layering in the background clouds to give it atmosphere. We wanted the clouds to feel, pregnant with a sense of anger to them.
Come closer.
And then we began layering in distortion effects, VFX emanating from his mouth.
Let me sentence you.
And the glows on the fires. And then the atmosphere. So we started adding wisps of wind, sand, the movement of the sand across the arena floor.
Where are you?
And then finally the color LUT pass, which basically cooled everything down and added bloom and all that kind of stuff. A lot of this VFX work was super important to the game and had to be done incrementally and very carefully because, again, at 60 frames per second, you really don't have a big pipe to play with. So it was always an interesting experience trying to get that level of richness into the frame. So Lust was the next level that we worked on, and the upper circles were pretty diverse across the board, and they were all a little bit more fantastical. Lust is really a barren landscape, save for a giant storm that swirls through, filled with bodies that are swirling all around the environment. They get dashed upon the rocks. And so before we really started work on the environment, we kind of attacked it from, a lot of times, especially for the upper circles, we ended up kind of looking at some of the key characters first. The minion that's in this level was called the Babylon whore. We called her the seductress as well. This was Wayne's kind of take on her. The idea of her was that she was this very beautiful female, and then as you got close, she would attack you through an embrace. And the embrace, at that point, she would kind of open up into something pretty horrific. So we kind of played with different ideas of kind of how to express that idea of something that would grasp you and transform itself. And Wayne looked at different kinds of iterations in terms of trying to communicate that across. In some cases, again, it got kind of, maybe a little this side of Alien. Some of this stuff would be great in Dead Space. And then in this example, he looked at something, a little bit more feminine in nature. And then in some cases, it completely almost overtook the human being where it would erupt out and you almost completely lose the human completely. But all of this stuff was kind of fun because, we were all blue skying at that point in time, and it was really great to kind of get these ideas out. This is where we ended up with the seductress. And then this is where we ended up with her attack, where basically she would completely open up and this giant proboscis would come out and attack you. Cleopatra was the main boss in the level, and these were the first iterations on her. Wayne had a good time with sort of designing her. Ultimately, she didn't make it into the game wholesale in this form, but there were ideas that we kind of pulled out of this that did. In the game itself, Cleopatra exists in two scales, one kind of a human scale and one at a giant scale. So we were looking at sort of like a lot of Egyptian imagery here. And this was the version that we went with, the human scaled one. And then this one didn't make it into the game, but I show it anyway just because I dig the design so much. So you can kind of see the shades of the damned sort of almost merged in with the fingers. And the architecture, the single piece of architecture in the level was really just a lone tower around which the storm swirled. And you can kind of see in the development of this, really, the skin looks torn, it looks twisted. It's almost as if the storm itself had completely tortured this tower over the millennia. And any time that there were lesions or that were kind of ripped open, we kind of almost merged the shades directly into the skin of the tower. And, you know, a lot of times after we would do a series of catalyst images and we kind of drill down into, you know, the high-level imagery of what we wanted for a particular circle, we would start to look at what I called kind of like an architectural vocab pass. In other words, withdrawing bits and pieces we knew that we would have a lot of, like what would a wall look like in this place? What would a floor look like? What are some textures that would... And this was kind of done as a package in order to start almost like a mini style guide for the level, so subsequent artists that kind of come in behind have something to follow, and we can kind of, you know, ensure a certain degree of cohesiveness to it. These are columns inside of Lust, and obviously, you know, it's, you know, the subject matter is very sexual, but I didn't want it to be sort of a one-liner, so we wanted to kind of create a certain degree of complexity by knotting bodies all together, and you kind of look at it, and, you know, in the darkness and in the, of the level, that kind of complexity of form, I think, kind of creates some pretty interesting shapes and stuff, so it's not kind of like completely sexually overt, but there's something more complex going on. Gluttony was the next level that we worked on, and that was fun in that it was probably the grossest level that we had a chance to work on. The reference material we gathered for this level was pretty messy, to say the least. But traditionally, at the gates of Gluttony, it's presided over by a creature called Cerberus. And from a Greek mythology point of view, Cerberus has always been represented as the three-headed dog. And so Wayne had an interesting take on that, which I'll show in a second. But these were some early catalyst images for what the environment of Gluttony would be like. In the poem, the damned are literally kind of, you know, buried up to their neck practically in their own filth. It's raining all the time. It's a pretty miserable environment. So we had this thing where, you know, much of the environment feels like it's, you know, vomiting. The sky and the atmosphere was influenced by looking at, you know, those photographs when they take a microscopic, you know, camera inside of, like, say, an egg yolk or inside of, you know, anatomical stuff, and you get that kind of almost albumin-colored kind of stuff. We allowed that to kind of influence the design of the sky. This was the minion inside of Gluttony. For whatever reason, we ended up calling her Bertha. I don't really know why. I can't remember now, but it was all about kind of consumption and designing creatures that were kind of, you know, focused in on that, and that was the model in-game. And as I said before, Cerberus was really the main star of the level, and we worked through different iterations with Wayne, and it wasn't until we kind of got to this one that it started feeling right. So this sense of obesity and very thick fleshiness, and just, you know, it feels like it's dripping all the time. So the creature at the back, which is that whitish kind of creature, really vomits forth the three-headed, you know, three-headed kind of tentacle-like, you know, eruption of more mouths. Incidentally, we got this from a fan who had a surprise party for her husband. This is a cake that somebody had made, and I thought that was pretty cool. I wonder how it tasted. And then here's some brief footage of Cerberus. And how he turned out in the game. So he's towering over Dante. So I'll briefly take you through some of the other catalyst images of the other circles. One of the things about doing a presentation like this is there's just so much material, it's hard to edit it all down. But this is anger, which occurred in a swamp, and some of the architectural vocab imagery from that. And on the other side of anger, you reach Dis, which is really the capital city of hell. So this is where a lot of this is really the quintessential hell that we kind of imagine. You know, everything's on fire. It's all about brimstone, all of that kind of stuff. It's not the fantastical stuff we saw in the upper circles. It's really kind of delivering on all that smoky darkness, fire, heat, all of that kind of stuff. It starts with this. And then we enter inside into heresy. And heresy really was about the burning tomb. So it's basically a complete underground strata that goes both horizontally and vertically, but it's filled with tons of these tombs in which the damned are burning alive inside of. And so we did this treatment where we designed a lot of these different tombs and created this modular system putting together these vast networks into which we would kind of bore a path for the player to wander through. Below heresy, we hit violence, and violence in and of itself as a level is probably the most self-contained diverse level, in that it starts with the river of boiling blood, where people are kind of literally boiling inside of. And it's presided, at that point in the poem, Dante comes across a minotaur. We decided to blow that out. The statue is absolutely huge. I don't know if you can kind of see, but on the far right-hand side of the frame, just below his hand, that's the scale of Dante. You basically descend down in front of this giant statue. But you cross the river of boiling blood and you come to the Wood of the Suicides. Here we played with the crown of thorns, almost, bringing in a little bit of that religious imagery again. And the trees themselves really have people infused into them. In the poem, Dante wanders through the Wood of the Suicides and he breaks a twig and it begins to bleed. And so sometimes we would actually, a lot of times in fact, we would blow out the scale of the human elements in the design simply to make them very kind of explicit. So it didn't always have to be a one-to-one scale. Again, sort of like ways that we could kind of twist people into the trees and get that kind of sense of pain. And then literally after the Wood of the Suicides, right there is the Abominable Sand. So there is no transition. He creates this environment where these three, very different kinds of environments are stacked one on top of one another, and you just go right into it. So, and then after that is fraud. Fraud is really a subset of 10 smaller ditches that are inside of one level. Fraud, and each ditch has to deal with a particular type of fraud, and it's otherwise known as the Malabolge. And this was really kind of like a level that was made up of a gauntlet of combat, one after another, and you crossed each of these ditches via a bridge, the center of which became the arena. And oftentimes we would look at ways to kind of use people as building elements. So in this case, these were kind of like a look at a way we could do bridge anchors and put people into it. So in terms of the character design, really, it broke down into 3 primary classes. We had the ruling class. Hell is a very majestic kingdom, and, we wanted to get that sense of hierarchy. Lucifer's the king, obviously, of that kingdom. And then we had this middle layer, which was really all of that kind of, taking the damned, and these were the bosses that emerged out of the damned. And so these were the worst offenders, if you will, their sins completely twisting them into something, quite mutated. And then the bottom layer was really sort of our living characters. The hero character began pretty early on. The first block of time was about 3.5 months that we spent in earnest on the character. Jeff Adams worked on that one. And we did tons and tons of thumbnails. This is just a small smattering of them. And early on, we tried different kinds of ways of illustrating what the character might look like. And at that time, his primary weapon was a sword and a mace. And we went through different iterations. The one thing that was a constant was the idea of the cross. Jonathan had written into the story the idea that the cross is one and part of Dante. He wears a cross that really recalls like a medieval tapestry, into which is wound sort of illustrations of his particular sin. And if you play the game, it actually has a story element. You go into the cross and it sort of takes you on a flashback recounting what Dante's committed in his past. So that was something that we kind of worked into the hero and looked at different ways that we could kind of do that. It wasn't until we started getting into this sketch that things started feeling interesting for me. One of the things was in this illustration really that the tapestry became almost like a binding, one that was really tight to the character. So there was this kind of sense of tension between the cross and his arms. And there was also sort of that metaphorical idea that Dante was literally bound by the cross. And so there was that sort of one and the same, but also that bondage element to it. And by this point in time, we started to bring in his primary weapon. We were already looking at the scythe. When you play the game, you obviously fight death at the very beginning, and that's in the demo. And so you take his scythe. He still has a sword at this point in time, but later on we lost the sword completely, and it just became about the scythe. And you can, traditional images of Dante Alighieri, the poet, have always had the laurel about him, and we abstracted that into something much more aggressive and put that into the headgear. And this was really the final version of the character. For the ruling class, we looked at kind of ways to express an idea of hierarchy, and ornamentation became kind of important, where we kind of imagined heaven to be very kind of finessed, very light, all of those kinds of things. Hell was exactly the opposite. It was about the beast. It was about being subjected to a heavy dose of gravity. It was about the earth. It was about, all of that kind of stuff. And so the horns became the primary source of ornamentation and how we dressed those and how we kind of designed those. A lot of the the armor on these guys really was crafted out of a material that would be like what we imagined to be bone, because we figured there's a huge pile of building material there, and that they probably would have used the shades to build stuff with. And obviously, as you kind of progress up the tree, the rack of horns becomes more signature. This is the rider. He rides a giant creature called the Tameable, which I'll show in a second. These are some different iterations on his horn elements. And then, of course, at the top of the hierarchy is Lucifer. We kind of took a shot at him pretty early on in the project as well. And in the poem, Dante writes about Lucifer having 3 heads. Each mouth of each head has the worst has a traitor in his mouth. Lucifer is down in treachery and is seen as the worst traitor. So when he writes about Lucifer, each of the mouths holds Judas, Cassius, and Brutus, yes, thank you, in the mouths. And so the 3-headed theme was pretty pervasive in all of these designs. And then in our version of it, basically, we kind of looked at ways to imbue a sense of nobility into him. And so if you kind of, in your mind's eye, anytime you've kind of imagined images of Louis XIV with this massive it's all about kind of the shoulders and the cape, and the horns became an abstracted crown. The cape itself was made of smoke and fire, and obviously he took shades and turned them into ornamentation. So a lot of the sort of almost that sash of skulls, if you will. And then without all of that robing on him, we imagine basically at the end of the game you actually obviously encounter Lucifer. So it's a mano a mano kind of thing. So this is without all that dressing. And I'll show a little bit of something from Lucifer. This is less about concept art, what I'm about to show you here, and really kind of I thought this might be interesting. We obviously did some high-level FMVs with Blur Studios, and they did a really crazy job. Wow, just beautiful stuff. But we PCAP'd a lot of our core actors, and there's some pretty interesting technology that went into this. But this is really a composite of kind of how they layered in the texturing and the animation, and how they drove the animation with some interesting tension maps.
There's just one last minor detail. There's just one last minor detail. There's just one last.
So you see the wrinkling on the forehead
detail.
And how.
There's just one last minor detail. There's just one last minor detail.
So that was fantastic in terms of the level of fidelity that you got out of the animation. They did great work for us. In terms of the beasts, we had these giant creatures called the Tameable. Dwayne Turner did a pass on these really early on. It was kind of a merging of different kinds of large-scale creatures, and we tried different scales of different things. Again, the idea of the beast with getting that kind of horn carapace about him. These guys were really large, lumbering creatures, very dumb but incredibly powerful. And then we went to something a little bit taller, a little bit more biped, and then got to about here. And then we had a few giants in the game as well. This is Phlegius. You actually ride him across the river Styx, and as you kind of proceed through Heresy, that's Dante in the very lower right of his foot. You actually kind of ride his crown. And then to the other extreme end of the scale, we had creatures like this. These were the unbaptized babies. Wayne took a swat at these, and then we decided to add some blades onto it. These guys attacked in packs. These are the guys from Greed, the Hoarder Wasters. Greed has this kind of myth about people who constantly roll boulders back and forth, so there's this never-ending, duality, and it's a bit of the Sisyphus myth, but essentially these are kind of a set of two guys bound together. One hoards gold, the other one completely throws it all away, and that giant thing that he's holding there is really a weapon. But again, the sort of stress nature of the skin, inflicting that kind of sense of pain. In Heresy, we had some priests, which, Heresy's all, we kind of took the slant of it being sort of the level for the pagans. And then this guy never made it into the game, but I wanted to show him as well. We do have a set of giants, as illustrated from the poem Inside of Treachery. Originally, we had a different game design for the giants, but this is Nimrod, who designed the Tower of Babel. So we really incorporated the idea of the architecture into his makeup, and at one time we thought it'd be really cool if he was an entire level where you move through him. And so I'm going to show some brief game footage here. So this is going to give you a look at Dis in action, and oops.
We moved toward the city, secure in our holy cause, and beheld such a fortress. And on every hand I saw a great plain of woe and cruel torment. Bitter tombs were scattered with flame, made to glow all over, hotter than iron need be for any craft. And such dire laments issued forth as come only from those who are truly wretched, suffering, and forever lost.
I will reclaim my rightful place in paradise. My path will be paved with the sins of man, and yours, Dante, shall be the bedrock of my return. And all that is good shall be gone from the universe forever!
So that's just about the tail end of it. I'll take some questions, but not before I sort of give credit where credit's due. This is the entire art team on Dante's Inferno. And it was a great opportunity and a great sort of privilege to work with these people, some incredibly, insanely talented people that I had a chance to work with. So If there's any questions anyone has, go ahead and I'll see if I can sort of illuminate anything that you might want to know about Inferno. If I can kind of see. Anyone? Yep.
I was just wondering where you drew the line on, like, going totally creepy and, like, what the studio said about trying to reach a mass audience and that sort of thing.
Okay, so the question was, where did we draw the line about going totally creepy and getting too controversial with the studio? Was that your question? Actually, to be honest with you, when we kind of started out, there wasn't really a line. The idea of blue skying was, early on, I didn't really want to impose too many limits on stuff. We knew when it got too controversial if, we're all in the video game industry, right? So we're used to kind of like, all kinds of bathroom humor and everything else. So when you get a group of guys that are used to that kind of stuff and you open something up and you're looking at something in a room and everyone kind of goes, ooh, I don't know. Like at that point in time, that maybe you've probably crossed the line a little bit too far. But, it was a mature title. So, but we did want to make sure that we weren't really about gore. We weren't really about making it really bloody. It was about making it have the sense of terror, but a surreal kind of terror as well, and something I kind of called captivatingly terrifying. It's kind of like looking at a car crash. You don't want to look, but at the same time you're kind of fascinated to look, and that's kind of what we wanted to paint hell to be like. Anyone else? Wow. Yep. Sorry? Okay, so the question was, we used a lot of external help. How much of that was internal? So all of these guys here are internal. We used 4 external guys, which were Wayne Barlow, Craig Mullins, Sam Mishlap, and Dwayne Turner. Those were our outside guys, and they were on the project for really only just the very, very beginning stages when we were still a team of about 12 people, and we're really trying to get out of the gate fast. Yep.
How long did you work on concept art before moving into production?
The question was, how long were we working on concept art before we moved into production? Honestly, concept art, probably we did a mountain of it in the first 4 to 6 months, but concept art for us was ongoing because as design starts ramping up for what the gameplay is going to be like, it shifts a lot of what we want to design. And for anyone who's worked on, a lot of these kinds of games, it's just there's a mountain of stuff to always be thinking about. So it went on pretty much through the life of production. Yeah. Yes?
Is there any sort of book available of your artwork and the process or anything like that?
So the question is there an art book or anything about the process? I believe that they're working on an art book right now. Actually, it's good that you brought it up. There's actually an art show as well at the Hotel des Arts, which is just sort of not too far from the Chinatown gates. There's a hotel there, but we're taking over the whole 4th floor. There's going to be an art show there as well. But yeah, there is talk about working on some kind of art book. It's on now. It starts today and it runs through the month of March. Yeah. Yes.
Is there anything you regret not making into the game that you've worked on in real life?
The question was, is there anything that I regretted that didn't make it into the game? Yeah, a few of those like giant creatures would have been really, really fun. But the reality of sort of making games, as many of you know, is that doing a lot of these things is a huge level of complexity, and you need to figure out like what you can kind of weigh. There's probably a lot of concept art. If I go into the folders, a lot of it that didn't make it into the game, and that's part of what generating this stuff is about. It's like really trying to explore ideas, and hopefully what you do is even the stuff that didn't make it in, you've kind of grabbed something out of it and put it into something that did make it in. Yep. Go ahead, you. Okay, so the question was how much time did we spend on, a typical amount of time on some of the characters before we kind of moved on? That really varied. There's no real answer to it. I would say that the major characters like Dante and Lucifer, they took a long time if you probably look at the span of how much we were kind of iterating on them. And some monsters would come instantly. Like somebody would kind of sit down and start designing something and, you would look at it and go, wow, that's really resonating well. And other ones, they just wouldn't kind of hit it. And it's actually kind of funny because a lot of times when you're doing concept art, some of the most innocuous stuff that you think is really simple takes the longest time. We had the design of these kind of chests that were going to be alive, and that went through every single concept artist on the team, and like probably about 6 months of time, and it was ridiculous. So yeah, there's no kind of easy measure, but time was up when we were kind of spanked and told time is up, really. Yep.
You already thought about what you could do for those purgatory or
The question is, have we already thought about what we could do for Dante's Purgatorio or Paradiso? I can't really answer that. I don't know if we're up for making one. I'm actually kind of working on Dead Space right now, and as far a lot of these games go, obviously you kind of you earn the right to kind of make a sequel, and so we'll see how this one does. As far as I know, it's doing pretty good. It's doing all right. So I don't know. I'm not that. Those kind of decisions are made above my pay grade in terms of whether or not we get to do this again. But ideas? If we could do it, sure. Yeah, there's always stuff kind of swimming around. This material that Dante Alighieri wrote was super, super rich, and it's great, inspiring stuff. Yeah. Yep. Sure. So the story was. So the question was, he enjoyed the storyline of Dante's Inferno and was wondering about the writing team and that level of it. So yes, Jonathan Knight, the senior EP and creative director, did a number of story treatments, but we also brought on Will Rokas, who wrote The Monsters Ball, that Halle Berry won an Academy Award for, but he did a treatment over top too. And one of the interesting things that he brought to the table was bringing in an interesting relationship between Lucifer, Dante, and Beatrice, who's the heroine, and he turned that into a little bit of a love triangle, which was kind of interesting. So Dante, obviously, his motivation for going into hell is to chase after Beatrice, but there's this really kind of strange relationship. Obviously, Lucifer kind of has her captive, but there's also this kind of subtext of Lucifer sort of seducing the love of Dante's life, Beatrice, as well. So, yeah. Yes?
How did you determine what shades were going to be in the game to be resolved?
Okay, yeah. So the question was, how do we determine what shades were going to be in the game? All of those came from the poem. Yeah. So, but in terms of exactly which ones, we kind of, we had an assistant producer kind of go through the entire poem and pull out the ones that were a little bit more notorious, a little bit better known, and those were the ones that we kind of pulled out and decided to use. Yeah, we couldn't put them all in, but yeah, those were the ones. That's how we kind of determined that. Yep. Any other questions? Yes.
What was the most difficult aspect of, concept art and designing the game? Like, what was the hardest part to really get down?
Okay, so the question was, what was the hardest part about the concept art? What was the hardest thing to get down? That varied. It wasn't always the same thing. Same type of thing was consistently hard. Like I said earlier, we had these stupid little chests that were just, they were a prop, but they were an important prop for the character to use, and we just couldn't get anything that felt right. And that took. I made a joke out of that actually at a team presentation where I showed, a number of slides of all the iterations we went through, and kind of out of a joke and frustration, I kind of showed the one that we eventually decided to go with, and I just, somewhere on the internet, I pulled a picture of a Humpty Dumpty chest from a kid's room out, and I kind of put it there, and I said, that's what we're going with. But a lot of times it was, gameplay was an interesting challenge, so sometimes it was level stuff. So, things that we had to, level design knew that they wanted a particular kind of way for gameplay to work, and we had to shoehorn it into the level in some way to make it authentic to the visual trajectory of what the level was about, but it still had to work as a gameplay device. Functionally, you had to be able to look at it as a player and understand, like, oh, that's what that thing does. Sometimes that became an interesting challenge. Yep. Yes?
Regarding your environment creation pipeline, how many artists do you have on one environment at a time? Or you have like one artist on one and do it all at the same time? How do you guys do that?
So the question was, what was our environment pipeline? Did we have one artist on it at any one time, or did we do them in parallel? We tended to do them in parallel. Usually the way I structured it was, if one particular level was in production where we were working directly with the level design team, so it had gotten to a point where it was becoming functional, there would be a group working on that, and then a level that I knew hadn't started yet, I would basically work directly with just one concept artist, and we would do those catalyst paintings. So we would just sit there and try, and always it was a big push to kind of get as far out ahead of the designers as we possibly could in terms of like the ideation. So we would do those catalyst images, we would do the architectural vocabulary kind of explorations, so that when artists did come on board and begin to kind of do designs that were directly related to the white boxes that the game designers were putting together, they had a pretty good kind of body of visual stuff to begin kind of building off of thematically. Yeah. Yes?
How much art did you personally do on the game?
The question is, how much artwork do I personally do on the game? Almost none now. Like at the beginning, I got a chance to do a bunch of stuff, but once we got into production, it's crazy incredible to try and even eke out time to breathe. But I spend most of my time during production overseeing a lot of sort of the art and working with those guys, so it really is much more kind of like at a higher level once you get into production. Yeah. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Was there somebody? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Kind of an appropriate question for the very end. Can you go back to the very beginning and tell us where the very first idea came from? Did it come from in the studio or in the company, or was it a gameplay idea, or was it based specifically Dante's Inferno, or was it, let's take a piece of literature and transform it into a game?
Okay. So the question was, going back all the way to the very, very beginning, how did the idea even start? So it really started in the mind of the senior EP, Jonathan Knight. I think he had been interested in an epic story of sorts for a while, and especially the Inferno and the Divine Comedy. And so I think it really started with him. He said that it's been on his mind for months. I think even while he was working on The Simpsons, even way back then, he had been thinking about it. So it's an age-old story, and it's incredibly... I'm surprised someone... I mean, there have been other games done on the Inferno, actually. I think somebody said there was one done on the Commodore 64 or something like that, way, way back when. But it's great. It's a great, great story, and I'm surprised more people haven't kind of attacked it earlier. So, that it? Oh, one more? Yep.
Sorry, I missed this, but what engine did you use? Did you use in the end? Did you use the Dead Space engine? Or?
We ended up using so the question was, what engine did we use? We ended up using a hybridized version of the Dead Space Godfather engine, tuned for 60 frames per second. Yep. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming out.